All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the House Environment and Transportation Committee. It is January 30th, and we are starting this afternoon with our fiscal briefing. So we will call up from the Department of Legislative Services, Dave Romans and Steve McCulloch. And please go ahead when you are ready. Good to see you guys.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Our goal is to go through the quick look part of our fiscal briefing to give you kind of a high-level overview of the governor's proposed budget and some of the implications. And then I will turn it over to Steve, who will talk to you more in detail about transportation, as he's our kind of lead transportation person. So let's start on page 1, which is on the screen, or if you have the document, page 1 of the document. Overall, the governor's budget is $67.3 billion. It grows about $800 million over the current year, about a 1% increase. General funds, which is much of the focus of this document, amount to about $27 billion, down about $274 million or 1%, largely due to there's a substantial amount of cost containment in this budget that I'll talk about further. Some key points on page 1, there's a general fund balance, so a cash balance at the end of fiscal 26 of $106 million. The rainy day fund has over $2 billion in it, which is about 8% of state's general fund revenues. What is not balanced is the Spending Affordability Committee had a goal of structural balance for fiscal 26. And what that means is ongoing revenues are sufficient to cover ongoing costs. The governor failed to meet that goal. He's short by about $186 million. To resolve that, you would need to...
Sorry to interrupt. Can you just try to pull the mic a little closer to you?
Sure.
Thank you.
So he's short about $186 million on the structural gap. That would require additional budget cuts or revenue actions to close that gap. I would say the General Assembly has always, with one exception, has complied with its spending goals in each of the last 40 plus years that there's been a Spending Affordability Committee. Other key point on page 1 is there's a Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act, which includes about $3 billion of actions, which is the biggest component of the governor's balancing plan. If we turn to page 2, the highlights of that document, or the BRFA, presented there. So just to be clear, the BRFA is just those things that require a statutory change. There are other budget cuts the governor could just do in the budget bill. So this is not all of the actions he's taking. At the top of the page, the largest segment of actions is revenue adjustments, $1.3 billion of revenue adjustments, about $700 million of it related to what the governor is calling income tax reform. I'll talk about that more in a couple of minutes. There's also an adjustment for capital gains. The governor's proposing a 1% capital gains surcharge, which would generate about $128 million from the personal income tax. Also under revenues, there's a proposed increase in the sports wagering tax from 15% to 30%, and table game tax rate on the casinos going from 20% to 25%. Transfers to the general fund is another big component of the balancing plan, about $633 million of actions in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act. The largest being the Local Income Tax Reserve Fund, where $230 million is being transferred to the general fund. It would be repaid over a 10-year period starting in fiscal 29. Of interest to this committee, perhaps, is the Strategic Energy Investment Fund. Alternative compliance payments are also being transferred to the general fund, $150 million of alternative compliance payments being transferred. I would also note, just while I'm talking about CEF, the governor is also proposing to put $180 million of CEF dollars into the dedicated purpose account for the state's climate pollution plan. And there is scant details exactly what they're going to do, but there was about $90 million done last year for that as well. So it continues that program at a higher level. Turning to spending reductions, there's about $1 billion in spending reductions. The largest single reduction is a cut to the appropriation to the rainy day fund. So putting less money in the rainy day fund. Again, you still have $2 billion in the rainy day fund after the cut. The governor is also proposing to increase the state's hospital assessment by $100 million on an annual basis. This is a surcharge on hospital charges that mainly is passed through to the payers. A small amount is absorbed by the hospital industry. The third big cut there is almost $93 million that affects local governments. So for teachers' retirement for the K through 12 system, the state pays for pension costs the normal costs, which is sort of the costs incurred for each year of service the teacher. So, the teachers all work in fiscal 26, and the local government pays for their future costs of their retirement for that year of service. The state, for a number of years now, has been paying any unfunded liability related to the teacher's retirement system. So you get an unfunded liability, for example, if investment returns for the state retirement system don't meet the expectations, you have a loss, someone has to make it up. The state is making up that loss. What the governor is proposing to do is to share the growth in that unfunded liability cost with the locals. So the state would pick up 93 million, the locals would pick up 93 million. So this means all of your local jurisdictions will be asked to pay that 93 million of costs they were not expecting. And it's the local government, not the LEA, that pays this particular cost. So those are the kind of some of the largest budget cuts. There's an extensive list on that page and further on in the document for those interested. Turning to page 3, I want to talk about the big picture for a minute. This looks at the structural budget outlook for fiscal 26 through 2030. The blue dotted line shows you the spending affordability briefing that Legislative Services did back in December and what we were forecasting. It's about a $2.5 billion structural gap in fiscal 26, $6 billion by 2030. The governor's proposal is the orange bars, and you can see the governor's proposal makes substantial progress throughout the 5-year period, leaving that 186 million shortfall in 26 that I already talked about. But even with the governor's proposal, which has lots of cuts in revenues, you still have a substantial problem beginning in fiscal 28 and growing by fiscal 30 to over $3 billion. So I would almost say this is sort of the first phase of your budget solution, and at some point in the next few years, you're going to need to have sort of a second round of rejiggering of the budget in terms of cuts or revenues or other actions. Turning to page 4, the pie chart there just looks at how did the governor resolve the budget deficit the Legislative Services was forecasting in December? On a cash basis, we thought there was a $3 billion shortfall for 26 and about a $400 million shortfall in the current year. The governor's proposal between the BRFA and other actions solves it with about 40% spending reductions, 40% new revenues, and about 20% transfers from various funds. Page 5 takes a little deeper dive on the spending reduction part of the picture. So this is comparing again to our forecast, Legislative Services forecast in December of spending. So there's $1 billion less because of the BRFA actions changing statute. Then if you look at the 3rd, 4th, and 5th bars from the left, there are 3 policy areas that I would highlight as areas that took cuts versus what was expected. The first is child care. The state has a child care scholarship program and provides subsidized child care to very low and moderate income children. The program has grown substantially from about 23,000 children in fiscal 23 to about 42,000 children currently. The governor is proposing to cap the program at 42,000 children for fiscal 26. The forecast had been that we would see enrollment grow to over 50,000 children. So it's substantial, like the people who are in will stay in, but it substantially caps growth in that program. Second area that saw a significant reduction is the University System of Maryland. In actual dollars, they're going to get 106 million less in fiscal 26 than they did in fiscal 25. Now, they obviously have options. They can make cuts to their planned spending and or raise tuition and fees to close that gap. The third policy area that I would highlight as seeing cuts is the developmental disabilities area. There is a substantial deficit in the current year. The governor has resolved it largely by providing additional funding, but also through about 97 million of general fund cuts. And then in fiscal 26, there's 235 million of general fund cuts to the developmental disabilities budget to try to slow the growth in that program. So those are the major areas that I think from a policy standpoint saw cuts. On the far right part of the chart, you can see areas that got more money, the biggest being Medicaid, which appears to be just differences in assumptions about enrollment and medical costs. There is a category there, about 187 million of what I would call discretionary enhancements, and those are highlighted on page 6. I'm not going to go through this list. You can take a look at it yourselves. What I would note about the list is about 2/3 of it is part of the governor's economic stimulus plan, because he's trying to stimulate the private sector economy in Maryland to grow, as we've had relatively sluggish growth in the last few years in terms of our job growth and so forth. All right, I'm going to switch gears on page 7 to the income tax proposal. There are a lot of elements to the governor's proposed income tax changes. One of the big ones is highlighted in the chart there, which shows the income tax brackets, both current and under the governor's proposal. We've highlighted in yellow the brackets that change. And we have the individual filer on the left-hand side, the joint filers on the right. So you can see the brackets change at the top and in the bottom. At the bottom, instead of having a series of different brackets for very small changes in amounts of income, the governor is standardizing at 4.70%. So for the first $1,000 of your taxable income, you're going to pay more. Same is true for the second $1,000 of your taxable income and the third $1,000. But after that, for the individual, from $3,000 to $100,000, you're seeing a tax cut in your rate going from 4.75% to 4.70%. So it's a very modest cut, but it is a cut for a substantial amount of income. This is one of the contributors to why the governor is saying quite a few people will see a tax reduction under his overall plan. At the top end, though, of the brackets, you can see there are 2 new brackets being added. Currently we have a 5.75% is the highest bracket in Maryland, and the governor is going to 6.25% and 6.5%. The 6.25% kicking in for the individual filer at $500,000, and the highest bracket kicking in at $1 million. So that's one set of changes. And then on top of that, he's layering in this 1% capital gains surcharge for people who have overall taxable income of $350,000 or more, and it would apply to all of your capital gains income. So it's sort of an extra 1%. That particular provision is for 4 years only. Everything else that I'm going to talk about on this page is permanent. That is a 4-year surcharge. The governor has explained this as funding his economic stimulus proposals that are sort of a 4-year package to try to grow the economy. And the other key changes are highlighted in the bullets later on the page. The most notable 2 are the governor's proposing doubling the standard deduction. So it would go to $5,600 for an individual filer, $11,200 for a joint filer. But at the same time, he's eliminating the option to itemize on your Maryland taxes. So nobody will be able to itemize on their Maryland taxes. You can still itemize on your federal taxes if you so choose. Currently, about 23% of Maryland taxpayers are itemizing. So it affects a small group of the total taxpayers, but a significant portion of people. So for those people, their taxes are likely going to go up, as the average itemization is close to $30,000. The standard deduction for joint filers will be $11,200. So you're going to have more taxable income for many households as a result of this plan. But I'd also point out for the standard deduction doubling, for those people who already are using the standard deduction, they're going to have less taxable income as a result. So again, that plays into why more people of more modest means are going to see a tax cut under the governor's plan. So those are the major tax changes. I'll leave it at that and turn to page 8. This chart shows you all of the revenues and fees that the governor is proposing to change. The first 2/3 of the page. It adds up to about $1.4 billion for fiscal 26 and relatively similar amounts in future years. We have color-coded where the revenues are going. So the black dollar amounts go to the general fund, the blue to the blueprint fund, the green are transportation trust fund revenues, which Steve will talk about more in a few minutes, and then the red are earmarked special funds for programs in the Department of Environment, Department of Agriculture, and so forth. So I've talked about the income tax. I just want to hit a couple of things on the tax and fee proposals. About 6 lines down, we get to the corporate income tax. Governor has a 2-pronged proposal. First, he wants to institute combined reporting, which has been proposed in the General Assembly many times. The second piece, though, is to reduce the corporate income tax rate from 8.25% to 7.99%, phasing that down over a 2-year period. You can see the fiscal impacts of those two proposals. Then a couple more lines down, there are proposed changes to death taxes, if you will. So the governor is proposing to eliminate the state's inheritance tax, which generates about $100 million of revenue annually. But the proposal is cost neutral because he backfills that lost revenue by lowering the estate tax exemption from estates of $5 million down to estates of $2 million. So more estates will be subject to the estate tax under this proposal. And in theory, it is cost neutral. I will just note, because you've probably heard from the registers of wills, the inheritance tax in the state, about 25% and a little more in some years, goes to fund the registers of wills in all of the jurisdictions. The governor inadvertently didn't provide an alternative funding source for the registers of wills while proposing the elimination of the inheritance tax. The administration is working on, some sort of proposal to deal with that issue. I will skip over the transportation revenues that Steve will talk about later on. I think that's kind of the key points on revenues. If you turn to page 9, K through 12 education, aid to the local school systems grows by a little over $550 million, or about 6% in the budget. There are, however, some proposed changes to the blueprint rollout plan, and they're highlighted in the second bullet and the sub-bullets there. The major changes are first for the behavioral health part of the blueprint, which is a consortium on coordinated community supports. The mandate in state law is $130 million a year. The governor is proposing to hold it at $40 million, which is the amount of funding that was provided in the current year's budget. He wants to just make that $40 million the permanent funding level rather than the $130. The second change that he's proposing is that starting in fiscal 26, the amount in the funding in the blueprint formulas increases to for collaborative time. So to reduce the amount of time a teacher spends in the classroom over a period of years from 80% to 60%. The governor is proposing to not do this until 2030, so delay the rollout of that for 4 years. It saves about $124 million in fiscal 26, saves about $900 million in fiscal 29. The third area of cost containment is there's a program within the blueprint rubric, the concentration of poverty. This targets money to schools, directly to the schools that have a high percentage of their students living in poverty. The governor fully funds the program in fiscal 26, but for fiscal years 27 and 28, he's proposing a pause on the growth in the program. So a school would still get what it received in fiscal 26, but most schools would have seen growth in 27 and 28. They will not. This saves about $70 million in the fiscal 27 and nearly $200 million in fiscal 28. So those are the three areas of major cost containment related to K through 12 education. Turning to page 10, I just wanted to make one comment here. It's on the third bullet, well, 2 comments. The third bullet down talks about state employees. There are, despite the difficult fiscal times, we have a 1% COLA that's been included in the budget, as well as the regular employee increments or merit increases, if you will, for state employees. That total cost is $180 million of general funds in fiscal 26. The next bullet down talks about local aid. What I would highlight here is I talked about teachers' retirement, but there's other cost shift to local government. Altogether, $144 million of costs are being shifted to local governments. Most of it to the local government itself, a little bit of it to the LEAs. So I'm sure you'll be hearing more about that. If for those of you who are interested in your individual jurisdiction's impact, page 60 of the full document has county by county what the impact is. Turning to page 11, just wanted to highlight here some of the kind of key fiscal issues for the session. One is obviously the sustainability of the budget. The second issue is that structural budget forecast that I showed you makes no assumptions about changes at the federal level. And we clearly have risks here, both in terms of the federal workforce being downsized or agencies being moved out of Maryland and that harming the Maryland economy in terms of lost revenues. The other risk is clearly the potential for cuts to federal grants that come to states and local governments. So, we don't know what those impacts will be. So there's no assumptions in the budget, but there's obviously significant risks on both the revenue and spending side from the unknown actions that may occur. The last thing I want to mention on page 11 is the Child Victims Act of 2023 that the General Assembly passed. It allows victims of sex abuse when they were in state custody to sue the state, has a tort claims cap per occurrence of $890,000. So far, about 3,500 people have come forward. Almost all of them were residents of juvenile services facilities at some time in the past. Some of these cases go back as far as the 1960s. This Attorney General's office has hired outside counsel with expertise in these types of cases, and they are negotiating with the plaintiffs. The hope, but not assurance, is that there will be some sort of settlement agreement reached before the end of session. The challenge is if there is a settlement agreement, then it probably needs to be funded in the budget. There's no funding in the budget for a settlement agreement, and there's no particular money earmarked on the side for a settlement agreement. So the Governor and General Assembly, if there is an agreement, will need to find a way to pay for any first-year settlement costs. So that's sort of a second risk to the budget beyond the federal changes. The last thing I'm going to talk about is on page 12. I just want to show you kind of what the blueprint outlook is under the governor's proposal. So the stacked bars in this graphic are the implementation costs by year of rolling out the blueprint program, which, as you know, rolls out through 2034. The different colors are how you would pay for it. The blue bars are the ongoing revenues that go to the Blueprint Fund from casino revenues, some sales tax revenue, a few other sources. The green part of the bars is showing you the fund balance that's being used from the Blueprint Fund. As right now, there's a substantial fund balance. So you can see that through fiscal 27, under the governor's plan, the Blueprint Fund can fully support the implementation of the Blueprint program. But starting in fiscal 28, we'll have exhausted our fund balance in the Blueprint Fund and just have the ongoing revenues. And they are not adequate to cover the continued implementation of the Blueprint program. So the yellow bars show what the general fund would need to pick up. And you can see about 1.1 billion in fiscal 28, about 2.6 billion by fiscal 30. That is a substantial portion of that structural budget challenge that I showed you earlier in that fiscal 28 to 30 period, is how to pay for Blueprint. With that, I will turn it over to Steve to talk about transportation.
Thank you, David. Transportation begins on page 41. So this first table, as I'm sure this committee is aware, last session, 2024, there were a number of new transportation revenues enacted. The table on page 41, the top shows the revenues that were increased or added, and the annual amount that's assumed in the current forecast that goes through 2030. And then, as Dave mentioned, the BRFA that was introduced includes significant transportation new revenues or increases as well, and those are shown on the bottom half of that table. So the largest source of new revenue being proposed by the governor is a retail delivery fee, which I believe this committee considered last year. This would be a 75-cent fee on each delivery that is subject to state tax, sales tax. That's expected to generate about $225 million per year. The second line of that shows the repeal of the vehicle trade-in allowance. Expected to generate $140 million per year. That is not a straight repeal of the trade-in allowance. It modifies it to apply only to vehicle purchases, not what's being traded in, but purchases of vehicles of $15,000 or less. So that means if somebody buys a vehicle that's for a purchase price of $16,000, there's no trade-in allowance at all on that fee. There is a one-time one-time fee in 2026, modifying the new registration fee phase-in that was passed last year. Last year, the phase-in for the registration increase was phased over 3 years. This proposal would pull that back to 2 years, and that brings forward $50 million of revenue into 2026. And then there are also proposal to increase both the VEEP fee and the VEEP late fee to $30 from the current $14. Actually, the late fee has a maximum $30, but the VEEP fee itself is at $14. And then there is a proposal to allow the Motor Vehicle Administration to increase its fees through the regulatory process in order to capture at least 115% of their costs. So they do have, in current law, they are required to collect at least 95% of their eligible costs through fees, and that's capped currently at 100%. So this would give them a little more room to generate fees. All total, these new proposals were about $2.15 billion over the 6-year program. Turning to the next page, this shows how this new and proposed revenues, both the ones passed last session and this session, since this is the first forecast that all of these new and proposed revenues are included. You can see that the total new revenues about $3.99 billion over the 6-year period. The first 3 bars following that first bar are revenue losses compared. This is comparing the current forecast with last year's 6-year forecast. So motor fuel tax revenue estimates declined by $323 million, comparing 6-year to 6-year. There's also a lower starting balance in the Transportation Trust Fund. There was, coming out of COVID, the department had been able to maintain some higher balances. That was used up. And then finally, the end of COVID funding assistance to the transportation. Last forecast was the last forecast that included any of that COVID assistance. Then the final 2 bars on that chart show increased spending, and the increased operating spending accounts for about $2 billion of this new revenue over the 6 years. That's about 51% of the total new revenues, and that leaves about $1.2 billion to fall to the capital program, which is, I would point out, as you recall from September, the draft forecast showed a $1.9 billion decrease. This is now showing an increase in spending, so it's really flipped around 180 degrees. Looking at the Consolidated Transportation Program on page 43, just shows the special, or the fund split out. Again, comparing last year's forecast and this year. I will note there was an error. This is a 5-year overlap, so it's only comparing the 5 years, 2025 through 2029, that both forecasts contain. And the increase in funding between the two is that $1.1 billion, $1.2 billion shown on the previous chart. You can see that special funds increased by $1.3 billion, but I did break out the fact that general fund transfers account for the $593 million of that in the current forecast, meaning the Transportation Trust Fund receives the general funds as a revenue and then spends it as a special fund. So broke that out. And then similarly, in terms of the other funds, which are generally funds that do not flow through the budget, in the current forecast, there is a proposal to use Garvey revenue bonds for up to $248 million during this 6-year period through 2030. There is a BRFA provision adding a use of the funds to the eligible uses for Garvey bonds. To date, Garveys have only ever been used in Maryland for the intercounty connector. The last debt service on that was retired in 2020. So this would be kind of the first new use under the authority that was passed in the last few years to allow Garveys under certain situations and for specified projects. Then finally, on page 44 is a graph that compares, again, this is a 5-year overlap. It compares last year CTP funding by mode to this year. You can see that state highway has a decrease of $575 million between the 2 years. Even with that decrease, it's still the largest mode of capital funding. But you can see that every other mode does see increases in the current CTP compared to the previous one, with the largest increase being in the Maryland Transit Administration of nearly $1 billion. That concludes my presentation, Mr. Chairman.
Great, thank you both. We have questions from Delegate Stein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you for your presentation. Dave, a couple questions from your presentation. First, on page 8, in terms of revenue increases, one of the assumptions is that if Congress extends the tax cut legislation from before, generates $300 million for the state. Could you explain that?
Right, so the Tax Cut and Jobs Act, which was under President Trump's previous term, expires at the end of this calendar year. And so the state's revenue estimate assumes it expires, and that actually results in us losing about $300 million a year in revenue. The major reason for that is one of the impacts of the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was we had about 50% of Maryland filers itemized before that act. Today, as I mentioned earlier, we have 23%. That is a big component of what that $300 million represents. Now, if for some reason the Tax Cut and Jobs Act was not extended, which this budget assumes, the governor's proposal makes everybody use the standard deduction. So it will, in effect, it will also generate that $300 million. What we show is the governor's income tax number is with Tax Cut and Jobs Act in place. If it's not in place, you can add $300 million in each of the years 27 through 30 to that number. So either way, under the governor's plan, we would get the money.
Okay, all right. My second question is there's the assumption that even though the governor's proposal to limit teacher collaborative time until fiscal year 2030, that it saves more than $100 million this year. Could you explain how that works?
Yes, so the core of our education funding system is the foundation formula, which is kind of everything builds off the foundation. The statute increases amounts, it's like $133 per pupil, increases the foundation amount starting in 26 to pay for collaborative time. The governor's saying, let's not increase it by that 133, let's delay that until 2030.
I see.
And that 133 grows in 27, 28, and 29. So it's not, it saves even more money each subsequent year.
Okay, so taking it out decreases the foundation formula for fiscal year 26, and so that yields the savings.
Right, decreases it against current law. Like
right.
So it's not a cut to the amount, but it's less than they would have got.
Okay, thank you.
Delegate Jacobs.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Romans, I just want to verify something. When you talked about the monies that would fall back to the responsibility of the counties, you mentioned $93 million, I think, that's split between the state and the counties on the pension fund. Is that right? Correct?
That's 93 that's shifting from the state to the counties.
Right.
Yep.
So, I mean, that there's a split of 93 each.
Yep.
And then in the blueprint on page 10, it was an additional $144 million that shifted back to the county. Is that correct?
So the 144 includes the 93. If you look at page 60, you can see the components of the 144 million. It's the teacher's retirement is 93 million. Non-public placements, which are special ed placements. The school systems are going to be asked to pick up more of the costs and the state will pay less. So that's 25 million of the cost shift. Community college retirement, they're doing the same thing as K through 12. That cost shifts about $4 million to locals. And then the other change is currently local governments pay 50% of the cost of the Department of Assessments and Taxation for doing property assessments. The administration is proposing raising that percent to 90% paid by the counties, 10% by the state. I think the logic of that number is that roughly 90% of the state's property tax revenues go to local governments. But it's those four things add up to the 144 million.
All right, thank you. And Mr. McCullough, since you're the transportation guru, in the fall, when we were getting CTP presentations, it came to our attention that the registration fees had not been collected on EVs, which we passed the bill last year that I think it was $125 registration fee on EVs. And in the fall, the indication was that those fees had not been collected yet because they hadn't figured out the program. Do you know whether that's in this or whether now that's being collected or not? Or do I need to talk to MVA?
We can check on that and get back, but I mean, they obviously are expecting that they've got it included in 2026. So the expectation on the department is that they'll have that figured out. But I don't know yet whether that's actually started.
Okay, because it hadn't started it in the fall, so I'm just verifying that number. Thank you very much.
Yeah, just to clarify, EV drivers pay normal registration fees. You're talking about the add-on fee for EV drivers. And we had a delayed effective date on that when it passed the General Assembly because they had to reprogram their computers to run a new program. So nothing is delayed. It was a delayed effective date on purpose. And so I will get my bill for my EV fee soon. Don't worry, Delegate Jacobs. Delegate Holmes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Mr. Romans, on slide number 7, there is an increase in the proposed tax rate by the 3 lowest income earners. My question is that proposed increase, is that being offset by the standard deduction or not?
So the dollar amounts shown there are based on your taxable income. So if the standard deduction goes up, someone who is only at $1,000, say, of income right now, they would fall off, but somebody else probably falls down to having taxable income of $1,000. But the other thing I just want to clarify is everybody in Maryland with taxable income, if you have $50,000 of taxable income, you're going to pay that whatever the percent is for your first $1,000. So it's not just for people who only have $1,000 or less of income. It's every tax filer with at least $1,000 of income pays that rate on their first $1,000. And then your next $1,000 under current law, you'd pay 3%. And then your next $1,000, you pay 4%. So it's not just people who only have that small amount of income.
And if I could, Mr. Chair, on slide number 10, the third bullet, there is a discussion about salary increases. Let me be selfish here. Would that include my chief of staff, and would that include me as well?
But no, it would not include legislators because your salaries are set in, you pass a,
Chief of staff doesn't count either, is that correct?
Right. Usually there's some money available to the General Assembly to decide how to allocate. You are not required to, the General Assembly doesn't always allocate money the same way that the executive does.
Finally, Mr. McCullough, slide number 44, there's the increase in MTA. Can you give us a brief discussion about the increase in the transportation, which causes that?
So the proposed revenue increases are allowing a lot of restoration of funding that was cut, in the draft CTP, but there's also more spending focused on the light rail system. As you may have heard, the state got a large federal grant to help with the rail vehicles themselves, replacements. But the system, the stations, the signaling, all of that also needs to be improved. in order for that whole system to work properly. And so a lot of that MTA increase is in that type of.
And none of that increase includes cost of the Key Bridge, does it?
No, the Key Bridge is not part of the Department of Transportation. It's the authority. And as we're all aware, the feds have, committed to paying for 100% of that, but that's through the toll facilities.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Delegate Stewart.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you all for coming. So, Mr. McCulloch, if you would go to page 8, speaking of the TTF, I like this color-coded thing you've got going on here. It makes it easy. So it looks like in the out years, we've got a total of $420 million new dollars heading to the TTF. How many more millions will we need in those out years to essentially make the TTF solvent?
The TTF, so unlike last year where it was announced that there was a shortfall, the shortfall occurred because there was more program spending put in the forecast than there was revenue to support it. That was a change from past practice and has not been continued. So the current forecast is balanced. It has sufficient revenues to pay for the operating and capital program, but the issue is there are many capital, especially capital side of things, many capital programs that are not in the CTP that people would like to see.
Right,
and so,
right. So we scale back our ambitions essentially in order to make it balanced.
Absolutely. Well, in order to fund the projects that people want to see funded.
Right. And do you have a rough estimate of how many more millions we would need to sort of meet previous year's ambitions of in the CTP?
It is, like all budgeting, is an exercise in funding what is possible with the revenues that people are willing to provide. So.
Okay, great. One question for Mr. Romans, if I could. So one thing I have heard anecdotally kind of out there in the ether is that a couple of years ago, Maryland's overall budget and structural deficit was in awesome shape. And then we had a massive budget surplus and we had no problems and it was all rosy. But then the legislators got their grubby fingers on it and they overspent on things like the blueprint and now everything's going to hell. Do you think that that's an accurate characterization of what has occurred in the last few years?
Well, I would start by saying that we have long forecasted a long-term structural deficit because there was never a plan to pay for all, the blueprint never had enough money in the blueprint fund to cover all the blueprint costs. So the magnitude of the structural deficit has gotten worse, but there was always going to be a long-term by 28, 29, 30.
Right.
Structural.
Yeah, I remember, I mean, I haven't been here forever, but I do remember, hearing in the 2019-2020 session, that one of our biggest focuses is going to be the structural deficit. You say always. How long has Maryland had a structural deficit of any size for?
Well, so when I say always, I'm talking about the out years because
No, of course, I know, yeah.
I mean, the blueprint isn't that old. So, I mean, we've had periods of time, including a few years ago, that in the near term, we were structurally balanced because we were having very strong revenue growth. We did have a period of time when the federal government provided us a lot of COVID relief and stimulus money that allowed us to do a lot of one-time things. So we've ebbed and flowed in structural imbalance. We've certainly had structural shortfalls projected more often than not over the last 25 years.
Okay, that's helpful. Last question. Would you say that the one-time COVID money and general federal largesse that we experienced a couple of years ago, would you say that helped us paper over what had been a persistent problem for years?
I don't know that I want to characterize it. What I would say is that we had very, very shockingly large surpluses for a few years, billions of dollars of general fund surplus. A substantial amount of that money was spent on one-time purposes. There was a lot of capital that was done using cash. Over like a 2-year period, we did over $3 billion of capital with cash. So kind of taking it as one-time revenue, let's spend it on one-time activities. There was also $1.7 billion transferred from the general fund to the blueprint fund to help address the longer-term problem of the blueprint fund not having enough money. So there was some increase in ongoing spending that contributes to some degree to the out-year problem we have, but there was also a lot of that substantial surplus used for one-time purposes because governor and the General Assembly recognized at the time that, yeah, this is not sustainable ongoing spending. We should use this for one-time purposes.
Got it. That's helpful. Thank you.
Great, let me just follow up on the Chair of Transportation's question. So first of all, the rainy day fund is projected at what percentage of the general fund now?
8%.
Okay, and pre-COVID, were we closer to like 5 or 6% usually?
Yes.
Okay, so a lot of the money went into the rainy day fund?
Yeah, we certainly have a lot more in the rainy day fund than we used to. Yes.
Okay, during the years of COVID largesse, did we do any tax changes?
There were some tax reductions during the COVID, during the period we had surpluses. There were also increases in things like the earned income tax credit was expanded some.
Right, so we essentially cut taxes with some of that largesse that we've heard about.
Yes.
Okay, and then on the transportation side, which is of course what I really want to talk about, just to zero in on what I think Chair Stewart was trying to get at. So let's just use highway user revenue as an example. This is a sort of the local share of state transportation revenue. I think in maybe 2022 was the last time the kind of formula was changed, the percentage. I think that expires relatively soon, so then the amount of aid that goes to the counties will go down. Do you know offhand when that expires?
It expires after 2027, so 2028 would be falling back to the new base rate of 15.6% of GMVRA.
Right, but that's fiscal year, so next summer, there will be a cut to the amount of money that goes to local governments from our transportation revenue.
They'll have one more. It's fiscal 2028, which starts, I'm sorry, yes, it starts in 2026, the summer of, yes.
Yeah, sorry, I don't mean the summer of 25, summer of 26.
2026, yes.
Okay, and then so if we were to extend highway user revenue, our state contribution to local roads and transit, or at least local roads in the case of highway user revenue, how much would it cost just to keep it at the current percentages?
It would cost about $100 million a year starting in 2028.
And that's not included in the governor's proposal?
Correct, not included.
Okay, and then just one more. In 2018, we required the Maryland Transit Administration to begin doing a capital needs inventory. I think then our comptroller, when she was not our comptroller, had a piece of legislation, the Transportation Safety and Investment Act, that mandated state of good repair, basically maintenance money, for the Maryland Transit Administration at a certain level. I think it's $450 million a year that's mandated at, and the governor's budget does cover the $450 million a year now, right?
It does.
Okay, I think they had said in the fall that they were not going to have enough money, but then with these revenue increases, they do. Is that right?
That's correct.
Okay, I think that capital needs inventory, though, is on a cycle, so we're going to get another one. Is it this year?
It should be this year.
Okay, and I'm guessing it's going to ask for more money for maintenance, not less money?
I don't know what exactly that will show, but the attainment report, which the department issues with the CTP and the forecast and shows the performance of the transportation system, does show an increase in unfunded state of good repair. But that's department-wide, and there was, according to the report, a change in methodology, which explains at least some of the increase. But according to their current methodology, state of good repair under non-funding is increasing. So
okay, and to your point, that includes State Highway Administration also has that problem that they do not have adequate revenue for state repair. And the governor's budget doesn't deal with those shortfalls.
Correct.
Okay, I appreciate that. So just to summarize, transit and roads both have unfunded needs even with the governor's budget here.
Correct.
Okay, thank you. Delegate Ruth turned her light off. I guess I covered her question, or I wore you all out. No more questions? Oh, there you go, Delegate Healy.
I'm sorry.
I think your lights were, they might have canceled out. Sorry,
Okay,
Delegate Healy.
that's okay. Thank you very much. Appreciate it. This is just a really quick question, and it's sort of going back. I spent a long time on Ways and Means, and one of the things that Ways and Means has done over decades has been to create tax breaks for various purposes and for various groups of people to encourage certain behaviors. The elimination of the option to itemize deductions, will that do away with all of the subtraction modifications that have been put into law over the time gone by?
No. It's just, when we talk about itemization, we're talking about, just like you do on your federal taxes, charitable giving, mortgage costs, real estate taxes, those sort of things. It doesn't affect any of the tax credits or other modifications that you're
The
mentioning.
subtraction modification is done usually when you're itemizing, what you could subtract from your federal income, which is moved over, and then you subtract, for instance, one of the ones that I was near and dear to my heart was adoption expenses. In the year when you adopt a child, that you could deduct that from that level just on your state taxes. But you had to do that when you were itemizing. If you do a broad, you couldn't access that. How would that work?
You're applying those to your federal adjusted gross income to get to a Maryland adjusted gross income. So you're still going to have a federal adjusted gross income. that you're
Right, but
making
then you
adjustments
start
to.
with the federal adjusted income, and then you have subtraction modifications and addition modifications that you can do, obviously. But I don't, if you're eliminating the option to itemize, how do you list those subtraction modifications on the tax form?
I can't speak to exactly how it'll be on the tax form, but there's nothing the governor is doing that eliminates all of those options to do that. You're still adjusting your federal
Okay, this
income. It's
seems,
gonna have to
maybe
be
it's a
different.
question for the comptroller. Thank you so
Yes,
much.
because you're still going to have people who itemize on their federal tax returns and then have to
Yeah,
do
but-
all sorts of adjustments to get to.
I'm not talking about what they itemize on their federal tax. I'm talking about what you itemize on your state tax that's different from, that's not taxed at the federal level, or there's no recognition of it at the federal level. It's not flowing through from your federal income tax.
Right.
It's something that the state does as a matter of policy.
Yes.
Okay, and
Okay.
again, none of that is changing with this. It's just those deductions that mirror the federal deductions. Delegate Lehman?
Mr. Romans and Mr. McCulloch for your presentation and breaking down the budget for us this way. So 2 quick questions. The first is on that 75-cent fee on delivered groceries. Did I hear correctly that that's the largest new source of revenue? And that figure is 225 million or 100?
225, if you look at page 41, it's listed there, and you can see.
Okay. So what I wanted to ask is, do we already have in place a similar fee on the delivery of prepared foods through like Grubhub and other services, or no?
This is not a delivery fee just for food. This is, Amazon's.
Oh, it is?
Any of those, yeah. So it's a retail delivery fee for the, the delivery companies.
Oh, okay.
For any order that is subject to state tax, sales tax. So if you're ordering groceries that are not subject to the state sales tax, that 75-cent delivery fee will not apply. Similar prescription medications, there are some other items that are not subject to state tax, and they won't be subject to the new, 75-cent
Okay.
delivery fee taxes.
Thank you for clarifying that. All I had heard was groceries, so thank you for that clarification. Second question goes back to the Delegate Jacobs' question on that $93 million split between state and local governments on teacher pensions. I was wondering, do we know if that shift would continue next year and become like a 40-60 split and continue in that direction, or are there no plans, any plans for the future on that?
So the governor in the Budget Reconciliation and Financing Act is proposing to permanently shift that 93 million. So in the future, the locals will pay the normal cost plus 93 million every year.
Okay, so the percentage would not change?
The
It's
percentage
for
would not
now
change. It would just be
93.
that 93 million would be a new ongoing cost.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Absolutely. Delegate Long.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Very briefly, referencing itemized deductions. So just to make sure I get understanding, if you are giving to a church, like tithe, offering, whatever, even to a charitable organization, that's adjusted now and how it's recorded and documented.
People who itemize on their federal returns, that's one of those deductions is the giving to charities. So then if they also are itemizing on their Maryland return, yeah, they're losing that ability to get tax relief for their charitable giving.
Wow, thank you.
Delegate Stein.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just to follow up to the point about the suggested delivery fee, that it only applies to items that are non-taxable within the state. When I go to the grocery store, if I buy 20 items, there might be 2 that are taxable, 18 non-taxable. So if I order the delivery of those, what happens? Is the fee applicable?
Yes, yeah. You'd pay the 75 cents because you had something taxable
That's
in your
something
order.
that's taxable. Okay.
Right, but just to be clear, it's not a percentage basis. It's just a flat 75-cent fee if one thing in your basket is taxable.
Correct.
Sounds really familiar.
And it's also, and it's also per order. So if you order, something from Amazon and they send it to you in 5 different, deliveries, it's a single 75-cent for the order. It's collected at the time.
Because you don't control how they distribute the goods to you.
Correct.
Got it. Delegate Morgan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Following on Delegate Long's question on charitable deductions, recognizing that many of the nonprofits in the state depend on contributions and the like from individuals, and we eliminate the itemized deduction to go to a standard deduction, has the governor looked at the impact that could cause nonprofits' inability to raise money because the deduction has gone away?
I can't speak to what the governor looked at or didn't look at. I will say, you still, if you're itemizing on your federal return, you're still getting the tax deduction related to your charitable giving on your federal return, and the federal tax rate is much higher than the Maryland tax rate. So I think it's hard to say how much Maryland getting rid of itemizing will affect people's charitable giving. It certainly has a slight disincentive, but again, as I say, if you're doing it for itemization reasons, you're still going to get that benefit on your federal return.
Okay, then if the negotiations on the Trump tax incentives moves to eliminate the SALT deduction and it becomes a full SALT deduction, will there be any effect to Maryland since your itemized deductions are going to be so significantly limited compared to where they are now?
If they change the SALT deduction on your federal returns, that would benefit Maryland taxpayers. On the state return, under the governor's plan, it doesn't matter what's happening at the federal level. You're going to just get a standard deduction.
Thank you.
Delegate Ruth?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just following up on the previous question. Under the federal tax cut, the 2017 tax cuts, weren't there changes made that significantly reduced your ability to deduct charitable, like the increase in the standard deduction and things like that?
Yes, as I was mentioning earlier, the federal tax change substantially changed taxpayer behavior in Maryland, going from roughly 50% of taxpayers itemizing to just 23% today. So it's substantially, we already saw a substantial shift in behavior as a result of TCJA.
So if the federal is extended, so we're already seeing impact on charitable organizations from those changes, and that impact will continue. So that would lessen the impact of Maryland's changes on the charitable giving. Does that a fair statement to say?
I think that's fair because many taxpayers are already switched to standard deduction and made, yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, we did. We used to itemize and now we get the standard. Thank you.
Great. All right. Well, thank you both very much. Colleagues, we're going to take a 3-minute break before we start bill hearings. So fill up that cup of coffee and be back in your seats at 2:03. Thanks.